At 25,000 feet over Germany, the loneliest man inside a B-17 was the tail gunner. He sat alone at the very back of the bomber, 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, a bicycle-style seat, 2.5 caliber machine guns, a sheet of plexiglass between him and the Luftwaffe. And outside that glass, German fighters were coming, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, fast, experienced, and trained to attack from behind. The Army Air Forces told tail gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, hold fire until the fighter came within 300 yards. Aim carefully. Fire short bursts. That sounded smart in a classroom. But in combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. And, by the time a tail gunner finally opened fire, he might already be dead. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth had seen it happen. He had watched German fighters come in from 6 o'clock. He had watched tail compartments explode before the gunner could react. He had watched bombers fall out of formation with the tail gun silent, so Arooth made a decision. He would not wait. He would not let the Luftwaffe choose the range. He would open fire early. 600 yards, 700 yards, even 800 yards, if German pilots wanted a clean shot. They would have to fly through his tracers first. Other gunners called it reckless. Officers worried he would run out of ammunition. The manual said he was wrong, but Arooth believed the manual was getting when killed. And on July 30th, 1943, on a brutal mission deep into Germany, he would prove that a tail gunner could do more than defend. He could change the fight. This is the story of Michael Arooth, the B-17 tail gunner who challenged standard doctrine, the gunner who fired before the enemy was ready, and the man whose aggressive tactics helped teach bomber crews that sometimes survival begins by breaking the rules. The B-17 Flying Fortress was built to defend itself. At least, that was the theory. It had guns in the nose, guns in the waist, guns in the ball turret, guns in the top turret, guns in the tail. When B-17s flew in formation, their fields of fire overlapped. One bomber protected the next. The formation became a moving wall of machine guns. That was the idea, but the Luftwaffe was not stupid. German fighter pilots studied the American formations. They learned the weak points. They learned when escorts would turn back. They learned how long gunners waited before opening fire. And they learned that the tail position was one of the most important places to attack. A fighter coming from directly behind had time, more time than a fighter making a head-on pass, more time than one crossing from the side. A Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could line up behind a bomber, close fast, and fire cannon shells into the tail. If the tail gunner died, the bomber lost its rear shield. Then the fighters could come back, again. And again, the tail gunner's job was to stop that from happening, but the job was brutal. He was separated from most of the crew. Alone in the narrow rear compartment, at high altitude, the cold was savage. The temperature could fall far below zero. His heated suit might be the only thing keeping him from freezing. His oxygen mask could ice up, his fingers could go numb, his guns could jam. And if enemy cannon fire hit the tail, there was almost nowhere to hide. That was the world Michael Arooth lived in. A tiny glass cage, 2 guns, and the entire rear sky to defend. Arooth was not satisfied with the official answer. Gunnery school taught patience. Wait until the target was close. Use short bursts. Do not waste ammunition. The logic seemed reasonable. A B-17 did not carry unlimited rounds. A long mission could bring many attacks. If a gunner burned through his ammunition too early, he might be helpless later. But Arooth saw the flaw. The doctrine assumed the enemy would let him wait. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots were already firing from farther away. They knew American gunners were trained to hold their triggers. So they used that delay. They opened fire before the Americans did. They damaged bombers before the defensive guns fully responded. They forced the B-17s to absorb the first punishment. Arooth did the math differently. A fighter at 700 yards was not impossible to hit, not if it was coming straight in, not if its nose was pointed at the tail, not if it was flying a predictable attack path. At long range, he might not destroy it, but he could force it to move. He could make the pilot dodge. He could ruin the firing angle. He could disrupt the attack before cannon shells started hitting the bomber. That was the key. Arooth was not just trying to shoot down fighters. He was trying to break their aim. A fighter pilot under fire had to react, even if the rounds missed. Even if the tracers were still short, the sight of bullets reaching toward the cockpit could make a pilot jink, roll, dive, or fire too early. That small reaction could save a bomber. Maybe the whole crew, so Arooth accepted the risk. He would spend more ammunition, but he would buy time. And in the bomber war over Europe, time was life. His first experiments were controversial. On early missions, Arooth began firing much earlier than the manuals recommended. When German fighters approached from the rear, he opened up before they entered ideal range. Long streams of tracers reached into the sky. Sometimes they missed. Sometimes they scared the attackers away. Sometimes the German pilots broke off before firing a proper burst. That was enough for Arooth. If the fighter never completed its attack, the bomber survived, but not everyone agreed. After one mission, the ammunition count looked bad. He had fired far more than expected. Ground crews and officers wondered if he was being careless. Other gunners heard about it. Some thought he was wasting rounds. Some thought he was gambling with the crew's survival. But Arooth looked at the results. His bomber kept coming home. The men around him were still alive. And other aircraft were not so lucky. The summer of 1943 was deadly for B-17 crews. Losses were mounting. Crews were being killed or captured before they ever reached the end of their required missions. The Luftwaffe still had strength. Deep raids into Germany meant long periods without fighter escort. P-47 Thunderbolts could cover part of the route, but they could not stay all the way to the target and back. When the escorts turned home, bomber crews felt the change immediately. The sky seemed emptier, the danger seemed closer, and somewhere ahead, German fighters were waiting. On July 30th, Arooth and the crew of Tondelayo flew toward Kassel. The mission would take them deep into enemy territory. The escort fighters would not be there forever. The tail gunner would need every round, and every decision would matter. The formation crossed the channel and climbed toward occupied Europe. From his tail position, Arooth watched England disappear behind them. The white cliffs faded, the water gave way to land. France, Belgium, then Germany. The P-47 escorts flew with the bomber stream at first. Their presence meant comfort. But everyone knew the truth. They would have to turn back. Fuel made the decision for them. The bombers would continue alone. When the Thunderbolts finally waggled their wings and turned toward England, Arooth knew the real mission had begun. Ahead, the Luftwaffe was assembling. The first fighters appeared behind the formation, small shapes at first, then wings, then yellow noses and black crosses, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing into position. Arooth counted them until counting no longer mattered. There were too many. One fighter began the first serious attack from high 6 o'clock. It came fast, diving toward the formation. Standard doctrine said wait. Arooth did not wait. At about 800 yards, he pressed the triggers. The twin Brownings came alive. Tracers streamed backward through the freezing air. The first rounds fell short. Arooth adjusted, walked the fire upward. The fighter kept coming. At closer range, the tracers began to reach it. Sparks flashed near the engine. The German pilot broke hard. Smoke trailed from the aircraft. It never completed the pass. Arooth had done exactly what he wanted. He had disrupted the attack before the fighter could settle in and fire accurately. But there was no time to watch it fall. Another attacker was already closing. The next fighter came lower, trying to slip under the tail guns. Arooth forced the guns down toward their mechanical limit. The angle was difficult. The fighter was fast. The closure rate was brutal. He fired anyway. The German pilot flinched. The attack broke early. Cannon shells went wide. Tondelayo stayed in formation. Then more fighters came. For nearly an hour, the attacks continued, wave after wave. German fighters slashed through the bomber stream. Some attacked from behind, some from below, some from high angles. They hunted damaged aircraft. They watched for stragglers. They looked for weak spots in the formation. Arooth fired at anything that threatened his bomber. He burned ammunition fast, far faster than doctrine recommended. His gun barrels heated from sustained fire. The tail compartment shook with recoil. Spent casings collected around him. Then, during one attack, a Messerschmitt came almost straight in from behind. It flew directly into his field of fire. Arooth centered the fighter in his sight. He held both triggers down, the Brownings hammered, a long burst poured into the approaching aircraft. This time, the effect was devastating. The fighter broke apart, pieces separated from the fuselage. The wreckage tumbled past the bomber. Arooth had another confirmed kill. But the mission was not even half over. The bombers still had to reach the target, drop, turn, and fight their way back. Castle was heavily defended. Flak burst around the bomber formation. Black clouds opened in the sky. Each one carried hot steel fragments capable of tearing through aircraft and men. The bomb run forced the B-17s to fly straight and level. That made them predictable, and the Luftwaffe knew it. Fighters pressed in with renewed aggression. This was the moment every bomber crew feared. No hard turns, no evasive maneuvers. No breaking formation, just hold course, trust the bombardier, trust the crew, trust the guns. A Focke-Wulf came in from the rear quarter. Arooth swung his guns toward it and fired. His rounds struck the fighter, but the German pilot kept coming. Then the cannon shells hit Tondelayo. Explosions tore through the tail section. The plexiglass shattered. Fragments ripped into Arooth's arm and shoulder. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. One of his guns jammed. Pain hit him hard. Blood began to freeze on the floor around him. But the fighter was still there, and the bomber still needed its tail gunner. Arooth kept firing with the weapon he had left. One gun, one arm, wounded, bleeding, still tracking. He caught the Focke-Wulf as it pulled away. A final burst hit the tail of the enemy aircraft. The fighter rolled and dropped away. Another kill. The crew called over the intercom. They wanted to know if he was alive. Arooth could barely answer, but he stayed at his post. There was no replacement in the tail. If he left, the rear of the bomber was open. So he wrapped what he could around the wound and waited for the next attack. The return flight was worse in a different way. Tondelayo had dropped its bombs. The formation turned west. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. Fresh fighters waited along the return route. Some had landed, rearmed, and climbed again. Others had been held back for the bomber's escape. The B-17s had to cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace before reaching the channel. Arooth's situation was desperate. One gun was jammed. He was wounded. His arm was numb. His ammunition was low. The aggressive fire that had protected the bomber earlier had cost him rounds. Now every shot had to count. A pair of Messerschmitts closed from behind and below. Arooth waited this time, not because the manual told him to, because he had almost nothing left to fire. At the right moment, he squeezed the trigger, a short, controlled burst. The tracers reached the lead fighter. The engine was hit. The Messerschmitt rolled away, trailing coolant. The second fighter broke off. That was the value of one accurate burst. Not just a kill, not just damage, it shattered the attack. The bomber kept going. By the time the formation crossed France and neared the channel, the fighter attacks began to fade. The Luftwaffe was reaching its own limits. Fuel, distance, damage, ammunition. The English Channel appeared ahead. For bomber crews, that sight could feel like life itself. Tondelayo reached RAF Kimbolton. When the bomber landed, Arooth could not get out by himself. Ground crew pulled him from the tail. He had multiple fragment wounds, but he was alive. So was his crew. And the story of what he had done spread fast. Other tail gunners began asking questions. Arooth had opened fire early. He had used far more ammunition than the training manuals recommended. He had disrupted attacks before German pilots could line up properly. He had shot down enemy fighters while wounded, and his bomber had come home. The gunnery officers reviewed the evidence. Gun camera footage, mission reports, damage reports, survival data. The pattern was hard to ignore. Early fire did more than chase fighters away. It forced attackers to maneuver. It broke their aim. It made them less accurate. It made rear attacks more dangerous for German pilots. That mattered. The official doctrine had been built around ammunition conservation. But conservation only mattered if the bomber survived long enough to use the ammunition. Arooth's method shifted the priority. Do not let the enemy reach the perfect firing position. Do not wait until the attacker is comfortable. Make him react early. Make him move. Make him fight through your fire before he can place his own. By late summer, other gunners in the group were trying variations of the same idea. Some fired earlier, some used longer bursts to disrupt formation attacks. Some coordinated more aggressively with nearby bombers. The results were not magic. Bombers still went down. German fighters still killed crews, but the old rear attack was becoming harder. The Luftwaffe noticed. German pilots began reporting that American tail gunners were opening fire sooner and at longer range. That changed the psychology of the approach. A fighter pilot who expected silence at 600 yards now saw tracers reaching out. Even if the rounds missed, the message was clear. The bomber was not waiting. The Germans adapted too. They increased attack speeds. They shifted angles. They tried high 6 o'clock attacks. They tried steeper approaches. They tried massing against specific formations. The air war became a contest of learning. One side changed, the other responded. Then the first side changed again. Arooth understood that his advantage would not last forever. Surprise fades, tactics spread. Enemies study what works against them. But for a time, aggressive early fire gave American gunners a tool they had not fully used before. It turned the tail gunner from a patient target into an active threat. In September 1943, Arooth flew again on another brutal deep mission. This time, the target was Stuttgart. The route was long. The defenses were heavy. The 379th Bombardment Group flew in a dangerous position. German fighters found them over France and began building strength. At first, attacks came from the front, then from the rear. Arooth was back in the tail. His guns had been serviced. His ammunition load increased. He knew the mission would test everything he had learned. When fighters began attacking from behind, he opened fire early again. Some broke off. Others pressed through. The battle became savage. A formation of Bf-109s attacked from low 6. Arooth fired into them, forcing several to maneuver. But there were too many. Cannon shells tore into the bomber formation. Nearby B-17s were hit. Engines smoked. Fuel leaked. Then a Focke-Wulf attacked Tondelayo from above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach. Arooth saw it too late. The shells hit first. His tail position exploded with fragments. His left gun was destroyed. Blood ran down his face. His arms and scalp were wounded. But again, he stayed on the right gun. Again, he kept firing. The Focke-Wulf pulled away, trailing smoke. Arooth wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. Tondelayo was badly hurt. Hydraulic lines were severed. Tail controls were damaged. Fuel tanks were punctured. The pilots fought the aircraft. The bomber was still flying, but its ability to stay with the formation was fading. The group reached Stuttgart. Tondelayo held on long enough to release its bombs. Then the damage became too much. The bomber fell out of formation. That was the moment crews feared most. A lone B-17 was vulnerable, but in this case, the Luftwaffe had other targets. Healthier bombers. Better chances. Tondelayo descended slowly, wounded and leaking. The crew knew England might be too far. The best chance became a controlled ditching in the English Channel. That was not safe. Ditching a B-17 could break the aircraft apart. Cold water could kill men quickly. Rescue depended on luck, location, and time, but it was better than crashing over enemy territory. Arooth stayed in the tail as long as he could. He watched for any fighter that might decide to finish them. None came. The bomber reached the channel, then hit the water hard. The impact tore the aircraft apart. Arooth was thrown forward. His head struck the gun mount. Everything went black. When he woke, he was in a life raft. British rescue boats were coming. All 10 crewmen had survived. Tondelayo was gone, resting beneath the gray water. But the crew lived, and Arooth's actions were now impossible to ignore. The recognition came later. Reports described how he continued firing while wounded, how his defensive fire protected the bomber during its most vulnerable moments, how his tactics challenged the old gunnery doctrine. Arooth received high decorations for his actions, but medals were only part of the story. The bigger impact was tactical. 8th Air Force gunnery staff reviewed data from many bomber groups. The conclusion became clearer. Tail gunners, who engaged at longer ranges, often had better survival outcomes than those who waited for close-range shots. The reason was not just accuracy. It was disruption. A fighter pilot needs stability before firing accurately. He needs to line up, hold his approach, judge range, control speed. If defensive fire forces him to maneuver early, that clean firing solution breaks down. He may still attack, he may still fire, but his accuracy suffers. And in bomber combat, A small decrease in enemy accuracy could mean the difference between damage and destruction. The official guidance eventually shifted, cautiously, bureaucratically, but it changed. Gunners were given more freedom to engage at extended ranges when tactical conditions justified it. The manuals did not become reckless, but they became less rigid. Arooth never set out to rewrite doctrine. He was trying to keep his crew alive. But sometimes doctrine changes because one man survives long enough to prove the old answer was incomplete. Arooth's combat career did not last forever. The wounds and head injuries took their toll. He returned to flight duty for a time. He completed additional missions. But recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat flying impossible. He was eventually grounded. His final score placed him among the most successful bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. But his influence went beyond the number of fighters credited to him. He was sent to training duties. There, he passed his experience to new gunners, young men preparing to fly over Germany. Men who would sit in tail compartments just like his. Men who would face the same split-second decisions: when to fire, how long to hold the burst, how to judge a closing fighter, how to survive when the manual did not match the sky. That may have been his most important mission. Not the kills, not the decorations, but teaching others what combat had taught him. After the war, Arooth stayed in uniform. He joined the United States Air Force when it became a separate service. He served for years after the fighting ended. Like many men from that generation, he did not turn his wartime experience into public performance. He married, raised a family, lived quietly. The medals stayed away from everyday life. The memories stayed mostly locked inside, but the story did not disappear completely. Crewmates, records, reunions, and memoirs preserved pieces of it. The bomber war had been too costly to forget, and men like Arooth had carried that cost in the loneliest stations in the sky. The tail gunner position no longer exists in modern air combat. The technology changed, the aircraft changed, the tactics changed. But the lesson from Arooth's story still matters. Doctrine is important, training is important, discipline is important, but doctrine can become dangerous when it stops matching reality. Arooth saw that German fighters had adapted to American gunnery rules. They knew when tail gunners waited. They exploited the pause, so he removed the pause. He made the enemy react sooner. He turned ammunition into time, and time into survival. That is what makes the story powerful. He was not a general. He was not designing grand strategy. He was not sitting in a planning room. He was alone in the tail of a B-17, freezing, bleeding, and fighting for the men in front of him. But from that small position, he challenged a system. He proved that the man closest to the danger sometimes understands the problem better than the manual does. That is not rebellion for its own sake. That is adaptation. And in war, adaptation can save lives. Most people remember the bomber war through images of huge formations crossing the sky, hundreds of B-17s, contrails stretching over Europe, bombs falling on factories and rail yards. But inside every one of those aircraft were individual battles: a pilot fighting controls, a navigator checking the route, a bombardier holding steady through flak, a ball turret gunner trapped under the belly, a tail gunner staring backward into the sky. Michael Arooth's war was fought through a plexiglass window at 6 o'clock. He saw the enemy coming straight at him. He knew the rules. Then he changed them. He fired early. He fired wounded. He fired with one gun. He fired when waiting would have meant death. And because he did, his crew survived missions that could have ended in fire over Germany or freezing water in the Channel. If Michael Arooth's story deserves to be remembered, hit the like button. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories. Because some heroes do not fly the plane, some sit alone in the tail. Watch the enemy come closer, and decide that the manual is wrong before it gets them killed.